those that like to have a beer or
Awesome.
drink can,
Yeah.
glass of wine. Those that don't, that's fine too.
Where's 700 Dawson?
Barton Springs goes this way, east and
Yeah.
west. Here's Lamar.
Yeah.
Go east, go
Right.
under the underpass. First one is Dawson Road, go up the hill.
Ah, oh, okay.
Right inside.
All right, yes,
We
okay.
it's just because it's free.
No, sure, it's a good place.
And I'll usually get some pizza or something.
All right, I'll see you out there. All right.
I'll be around.
Let me close it, yeah, close it over there. One thing I wanted to ask you is,
It's bright, but it's fine. For photos, I'm good with or without my glasses. I've got some notes I was going to look at, and I think I'm okay. I'm better with my glasses, I guess. But I know that we're also looking for a monologue, basically, into the camera. So, you want to prompt me with questions?
yes, yeah, I have a couple questions. First of all, one is, it's has to do with maybe expecting that your loved ones are not going to be able to give you, or they're going to say some stupid things to you that they don't, that they are well intended and so forth, and how to kind of expect them to be uncomfortable and so forth, and just to, you know what I'm trying to say. So,
Say things to me as a chaplain, and then what do I do with those?
well, say,
Or just say things in general?
say platitudes or things that are, well, you still have two sons, or you know,
Okay.
things like that that in the moment sound as if they're going to be helpful.
So things that I might say, or the chaplain might say.
No, that a family member might say to the survivor, and cutting their friends a little bit of slack because they're going to say some
Okay.
stupid things to you and so forth.
All right.
That would be one of them, and to I guess to what perhaps to expect in the next year. That's the period of time when this is happening. It's not right after it, but it's about. Let's put it this way: the funeral's over, the gathering is gone, put all the food away, and the door is slammed. Okay.
Now what?
Now what? Okay. Empty house. What now? And
Okay. Would any of this be appropriate in Spanish also?
yeah.
I'm fluent.
Really? I'm not sure I would know how to edit it, but if you start.
Well, we could do something now, or we could do it a little later. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
just saying, if you want to, at some point, if you want
Yes.
that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
You'll tell me if that's, or when you'd like to have that,
Yes.
whether it's now or some other time, okay?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. First of all, I want you to just go ahead and introduce yourself.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm Steve Rekedal. I live in Austin, Texas. My wife and I have been here for, going on 2 decades. I'm active in a church called Hope Chapel, an independent church where we have several chaplains who serve in the police force or in the marketplace. I'm also bivocational in that I've been in the insurance business for a long time. And I've been invited to join the chaplains group and participate based on the experiences and the history that I have in chaplaincy.
First of all, any general advice you'd give to someone who is in the situation where they're suddenly alone, and not the acute pain of it, but it has now been a week, and they're alone for the first time, perhaps in a long time.
Alone is a terrifying word, and in particular, isolation, which happens in aloneness, is a terrifying place. And now that a person's been left behind, It's always harder for the person left behind in a way because the void is there. There's a hole there and an expectancy that any moment the phone will ring, or at 5 o'clock on Tuesday, we always do. And it comes 5 o'clock Tuesday and we're not doing because there is no we. So how do we approach that? How does a person live in that? Well, unfortunately, there are people who will come along and try to help, try to fix the problem, try to say, well, you're really not alone, or come to my house, let's go do something, as if having an activity that would interfere or distract from the process of grieving, as if that were useful. And sometimes it is useful to break a cycle of pity, or a cycle of depression, cycle of sorrow. But in fact, after that week or two and the door is shut and the phone isn't ringing anymore, what do we do? How do we face those times? And so I believe in terms of a relationship, if we're isolated, we're alone, there's no relationship with any kind of spiritual entity, a higher power, God as you understand him, or even a more specific relationship with Jesus Christ, or with the God of Allah even, then that isolation can become the place of our own imaginations. And so to walk through that alone, to anticipate that somehow I'm going to get through this on my own, is, I think, a deception that will lead us to a dead end. Sometimes, unfortunately, dead end resulting with excess drinking or other escapisms, even drugs, overly medicinal comfort. And so, break the cycle, but not as if the cycle doesn't exist. Break the cycle as if it is something to go through, as if it is important, but also to be purposeful about it. And how do we do that? Well, we don't do that in isolation. We do that in community. So beyond that, we can go more specifically, but the community idea, we are in community even if somehow we're alone after some period of time. We are still in community if we're willing to receive it, accept it.
What do you mean by that, in community?
Well, before we lost a loved one, before we lost that one person, we were in community. There were at least two of us, and more likely whether it was church or the bridge group or the car club or the thing that we did together, there was a community of people. Maybe it was our hobby, or maybe it was just extended family. But we were in community. Now that we're alone and somehow part of us is gone, it's not here anymore because we were so one with the one we've lost. Even so, the community is still there. And so going back into that community, whether it's family, extended family, which sometimes can be difficult, or friends where we were known and we know people, going to places where we're known and we don't have to explain ourselves or give much history can be a very safe place, a good way to start to raise that horizon that all of a sudden has gotten so low when we lost our loved one.
Have you seen, you've obviously seen examples of people going through the grief process well and going through the grief process poorly. Mm-hmm. And first of all, what do we mean by going through it well and going through it poorly? And what distinguished those two people?
It's a very challenging differentiation because grief for each person is so personal. And yet there is a stage in the grief process where a person could wind up really doing well. Doing well for me would be able to talk about the loss, able to talk about the sorrow, the loneliness. I think, and I'll use my father as an example. My father lost our mom a few years ago, and now he's lost another very, very close friend. And what he said to me just recently was, this is going to be a lonely time. Well, that for me is an example of somebody, he's going to be facing this unhappily, yes, but he knows it's going to be lonely. And so how do you face that? Well, you face it and go through it. Versus a person who, and we've had a lot of experiences with this, a person who in facing the grief then becomes angry, becomes a person of resentment. And in the resentments and anger, to find a way to relieve that, begin to self-abuse, whether it's through the drinking, alcoholism problems, maybe addiction to a food, a turning away from people who would be friends in anger. And so the ability to be tolerant and to tolerate runs very short. And it's quite evident if you just poke and probe a little bit, versus the person who's willing to, in humility, accept that they don't like the situation and they're going to walk through it, but they're going to be public about it. More specifically, if we looked at a person who is not doing well in grief, there is still an anger, a sorrow, a sadness that won't go away after maybe sometimes years. Versus a person who after several months, maybe a year, has said, this is very lonesome, I'm very sad, and I'm moving ahead, and then they're willing to talk about it.
We're going to move into the blighted thing just a little bit.
Okay.
I want to talk to you a little bit more about some older guys when it comes to grieving.
Are we getting some specifics? Or?
This.
Yeah, okay. Okay. These are probing questions that you don't find in a textbook, you know. It's clear you've been through this process yourself.
You know, I did. When I started this process, because of a loss that seemed to many people to be trivial, but it wasn't trivial to me.
No.
He's buried right behind me here, which is my dog, for 12 years. And it was the hardest thing I've ever done.
We have a very good friend who's on our church board. She just lost her dog. And she's devastated. And you know what? It's very real.
Yeah.
It's very real. Yeah.
We were inseparable.
As was she. Now, if you'd said that to me about your pet snake or your pet fish, I'd also sympathize, but it'd be a shorter story.
How do you, trying to get, I guess, older gentlemen who, at least when I grew up in the Midwest, it's pretty tough to get some of these older guys to say, even, this is going to be a lonely time for you away from this planet. But if I'd heard my father say that, I mean, at the very end, he did say things that it took a long time to get him to say. But to get that older, especially sometimes men, to get to say things that they need to say, do you have any tricks in your bag that you're able to pull out and make that happen, or?
It's an excellent question. I, too, grew up in the Midwest, German and Scandinavian communities. And I recognize, in fact, have been part of a social group where after maybe part of a keg of beer or after some peppermint schnapps or the things that they would call their recreation, they might start to leak a little bit, some of to give some side comments, so you watch for those. But you can't do that on purpose. I mean, that's not fair. But I'll be blunt. I have found that by spending time getting into the rhythm of their lives, for instance, my father liked to hunt. I would go hunting with him. I don't really care about hunting. But getting around that fire at night or that early morning coffee cup, and maybe the ducks are flying or that deer walks through, or fishing in that boat, and you're out there and the calm and the peace, something may come out. The point is to spend the time. And it really does, in many of those guys' lives, it really does take time. There's a sort of vocabulary of love languages. Some people like to give gifts, it's their love language. Some people like to have themselves talked about or to be complimented, it's their love language. Some guys just like time. And whether that is a particular bent or gift of the person that you were talking about who isn't very open, Uh, Time is an amazing quality if you can just invest it without a particular agenda. I do know this, Phil, and it's proven time and again. If I'm with someone or we're in a small group and there's silence, if I start to get uncomfortable and feel a need to break that silence, someplace in there, there's something vital going on that my breaking the silence could interrupt. And so I've learned over time, if it's silent because something is going on. That's not a real good formula, and it's really not a trick in the bag. But it also, because grieving is so personal, it also may be an indicator of what that person's real outlet is. And so even asking something about a hobby or about the person who's now gone, what did they like to do? What were the things that they really enjoyed doing? Somehow provoking thoughts towards something positive that characterized that person. Sometimes can be a help. It probably doesn't happen in the first or second meeting, though, because there is a trust factor.
I think, too, you'd be surprised at how sentimental the toughest guys are. Very surprising things that I would find that my father kept that I thought he just weren't even on the radar. Much more sentimental than I gave him credit for. And it is a period of time when you lose one parent to really find out. Unfortunately, it takes death sometimes to find out about the other, the surviving one.
That's right.
Or at the end of life to find out about them. What part of the Midwest were you?
Well, I was born and raised in Minnesota,
Yeah.
and the German, Swedish, Norwegian communities there. I remember incidents from my childhood that I bring up to my father now, who is in decline mentally. I'll bring up an incident like the first time he taught me how to drink coffee. And I'll say that and give him details about it, and then there'll be something that harkens back, oh yeah, and then he'll get a smile, and that provokes a story. And I think one of the ways of dealing with grief is to have them tell stories. And so whether it's a story from my childhood that then provokes him, or a story about the first dog that he ever had. Tell me about your dog. I know it was a Boston Terrier. Oh yes, and then the point is, as he starts to talk, or as they start to talk about anything that they have some detail on, there's a kind of freshness, a kind of personality then that comes out. And I believe that in the grieving process, if the personality has an opportunity to exercise, to somehow get a little bit of breathing space, that then there's an ability for, let's call it a wrinkle in time or an opening in the psyche almost, that then if it's a spirit of God or the spirit of healing can sort of slip into that place that's now been opened. And so telling stories has been a remarkable avenue. I happen to work in the Spanish community too, Spanish speaking, and that's that can be a very closed community as far as emotions go, or men expressing emotions. Usually the women lead the way there. But I found with men, especially if we can get them to start telling stories, that's a great place of exposure, of transparency. And it seems like with transparency on almost any basis, unless it's anger or resentment, transparency on any basis that's somewhat positive really is a place of healing. Later they'll say, I hadn't thought about that for a long time, you know. I really enjoyed talking about that. And then to hear them say, I enjoyed talking, now there's opportunity for growth, I guess.
It's almost always mistaken that they don't want to talk about the one that they lost. I think my experience has been, I guess, is that they actually want to talk about it a lot, want to talk about them. And I do remember that my grandmother had to, almost every time I saw her, had to tell me the story about when she found Grandpa dead on the bed. And she had to tell the story. And there was it's almost as if when you wake up from a nightmare, you have got to get it out of your system. And she had to do that, and I sat through that story I don't know how many times. And what is that? What is that about, do you think?
It's an excellent question, and it may have to do with just age and the fact that in mental decline, without knowing your grandmother, mental decline, that the older stories are the ones that are most easily remembered because short-term memory goes. But usually on a tragic incident or something that's so traumatic like that, my experience has been that it's another way of confirming that there was something real, there was something valid, that it did end, but in its ending, it still is valid. My father does that with some of the memories he has. I think probably the one example in my personal life that was the most difficult. I had a brother who committed suicide at age 18, younger than I. My mother found him. And she was unwilling to talk about that for over 25 years. She just couldn't talk about it. And then there was an incident that just opened up the floodgates, and there was a wonderful experience of healing and self-forgiveness. That took 25 years. I don't recommend that for anybody. But the point is that if we'll look for the opportunity to hear the story, and maybe even Grandma, often you've told me about a story that finding Grandpa, that was really an important day. That was really a sad day, wasn't it? And then she talks, and now there's a little more healing or a little more connection. So I think, but again, because grieving is so personal, that it really is unique to each person almost. And yet you know if a person's angry about something, that they're not yet through to the place of peace. And but that's a good question, a good observation.
Do you ever discuss with someone who's lost someone that it is part of the human experience, in that if we lived in this life forever, the experience would be that we would probably, I guess our minds are as such that we would probably grow strange, and there would be another kind of death. I mean, that it's impossible to imagine, I guess, in this form, living forever. And that because we are aware of our mortality, life gives life some kind of resonance, because it is, there's a mystery that underlies it and so forth. I know it's a tough question, but...
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked it, because the theologians would have an opinion. But in practice, I think it's a good question. It's really vital in the grieving process, and maybe you don't get to that question early because the pain is so real.
There's a famous speech given at a funeral of an infant, and they asked the man to speak, and said the only thing that would be harder to endure than this is if we lived in a world where we saw love die instead of not each other, and that could happen if life just kind of went on and on and on and on and on. And,
Yeah.
What do you say? What do you say to someone who's lost a child? It's tough.
There's my hesitancy in talking about it is because it really is hard to speak to it. If I'm going to console somebody who's just lost a little one, the first consolation approach I'm going to use is silence. And then I will, at some point, just by being there, they're aware that something, and I'm there, and that's fine, but they're so caught up. And the next question, or the first question I would ask then is, how are you doing? And if I ask a person who's recently lost a child, how are you doing? There may be a good response or maybe nothing, but at least we're still focusing there as opposed to what I might want to say. Your child is better off. God must have had a reason. Anything that would somehow deny the immense disappointment and loss, and then the resultant anger, anything that would somehow deny that or defer it is just so disingenuous, and it's disrespectful, both to the person who's had the loss and the person who's lost. I think the question of how long do we live, or in the Bible there's one of the Psalms that says, how then shall we live? That question is really a metaphysical question that right now we're looking at with the medical community. I mean, we've got people living into their 90s, 100 plus, and their brains, their minds are in some condition, maybe gone, but the body is chugging along. And they're